welcome to another episode of Tell Me Everything. I'm kind of freaking out right now because I am with the one, the only Kevin Allison. He is a comedian, he is a writer, and everybody mostly knows him, or at least I mostly know him, as the founder and creator of Risk and the Risk podcast. So welcome to the show. I'm so very excited to have you here.
Oh, thank you so much. I'm so thrilled to be here.
I guess I want to start out the conversation with, I wanted everyone to know how much the podcast that you started meant to me. And before we dive into, I'm so fascinated by your story and everything like that. I just want you to know that the show changed my life in a lot of ways. And I remember listening to it over a decade ago. And I grew up in a very conservative community, very narrow-minded. And the podcast was on my drive to college. I commuted for my first couple years in college, and it was over an hour commute. And I would listen to the podcast, and it was my first introduction to diversity and to these different worlds and people and their truth and their stories. And it just made me feel like I wasn't scared of the world.
Wow, that's profound.
Yeah, and it was such a big deal. And I look back, back when I was in Michigan making those trips and listening to all those wonderful stories and hearing your voice, and just thinking it just seemed like such a foreign concept in New York and all of these things. And now that I'm here talking to you, it's really, really, it's like very heady. Oh, go ahead.
Oh, I was going to say, that is so reassuring to hear. I have heard that a lot from people, but I never get tired of it. It really is kind of fuel for my soul to keep going on, because the creation of the show, of Risk, has everything to do with my own life of, I grew up in the 1970s in Cincinnati, Ohio, at a time when that city was famous for being sex negative. All kinds of sex-related trials were there. And in a very, very devoutly Catholic family and in a very Republican society. and unlike a lot of children, I grew up super conscious at the front of my consciousness, knowing I was gay, in my toddler years. Going to kindergarten was a real struggle for me because I was afraid kids would learn that I was a boy who was attracted to boys, which is a hefty thing for a kindergartner to have weighing on his soul.
Yeah.
So really what Risk was when I turned 39 was me realizing that I think my life's path is to help people who do feel like there's something they've experienced that they really have a hard time sharing with others, or that there's something they've been hiding, or there's something that makes them feel like a freak, or that they're really insecure about. I guess that my whole life has been about teaching people that it's okay and safe to come out if you do it with emotional intelligence and speak into listening, in a wise way. And Risk is a place where people can definitely do that about anything.
Yeah, that is one of the many reasons why I love you. Just the very idea and the very nature of who you are and what you've created with Risk is this service to the community, service to the public. And I love that. I want to ask you, you said something so profound earlier. How was it being such a young age and being so aware that you were different, and that that you were aware of your attractions, that you were aware that you might not be like many other boys around you?
Well, it's funny because throughout the first, 7 or 8 years of Risk, I used to tell in interviews, I used to say, well, I myself have never had a trauma, but I help people share about traumas. And I was thinking in terms of, like some of the people who have been on the show who have like accidentally killed someone, or, became addicted to heroin, or,
Yeah.
whatever, or, had a miscarriage, whatever it might be, something traumatic that happened to them. But I read an article a couple of years ago that a bunch of psychologists put together, saying that many gay men, especially ones that were conscious in their childhood that they were gay, but that were hiding it all that time, experience what we call long-term trauma, which is harder for psychologists and psychiatrists to work with because it's even more deeply embedded. And
Yeah.
so, yeah, it was terrifying. I thought that I was going to hell.
Yes.
I spent a lot of time I remember being in the first grade and walking down the hallway and looking at some kid's butt in his pants, like just walking down the hallway and looking at his butt and telling myself, stop it, stop looking at that, stop thinking about that. And so, yeah, there was just always this trying not to be who I was, and fear, a real fear that I would lose my family, lose my friends. I remember Eddie Murphy, when I was in the third grade, Eddie Murphy's routine that is, I think, just called Faggots on his album, about just having fun, screaming at gay people out of car windows as he's passing by. It's like, I listened to it today and I'm like, there is like no humor quality that's not even a good joke by any standard. But no, I remember when kids started doing that routine on the playground when I was in third grade. And a friend of mine, a good friend of mine who had been exposed to a lot more sex talk from the older boys who lived next door, so he had learned a thing or two about how sex works, he sat me down on the playground one day and explained, oh yeah, gay people are a thing that exists, but they're all in New York City, and a lot of people think we should ship them off to an island and drop a bomb on it or something like that.
Oh my gosh.
So yeah, and then seventh grade was when I dared to come out to a friend for the first time and lost that friendship immediately. And then sophomore year was the second time that I decided to come out to someone and then lost that friendship immediately. So when you think about it, yeah, there was a lot of trauma there.
Yeah.
And I developed, how did I deal with it? By becoming a comedian. In kindergarten, I noticed, I was so afraid, first day of kindergarten, people are gonna find out I'm gay. But then, first day of kindergarten, I pulled a little silent comedy routine and made a girl on the other side of the classroom laugh, and instantly it clicked in my mind, oh, I can be weird. People can know I'm weird inside, but I can control it in a performative way and control the reason they're laughing at me,
Right.
and make it be like, well, yes, I'm weird, but you kind of like it, don't you? I'm likable,
Kind of beat them to the punch.
Yeah, and I think a lot of comedians like that have experiences like that when they were younger. It's a defense mechanism largely. Yeah. So yeah, it was definitely it was definitely rough, but at the same time, people really did love me. My family really did love me, and my dad was upset at me when I was 18, when I came out, because he was like, you could have told us that a lot earlier. You know what I mean? So yeah. So
that's really profound. Yeah. Like it was do you feel like it was one of those things where he kind of knew sooner rather than later and just was like more upset that you just didn't own it sooner rather than later?
Yeah.
Wow.
He actually took me out on a walk when I was a sophomore in high school, to go get a milkshake together. And he started this speech while we're walking down the road about how, some of the men that I admire the most in history had a different way of expressing like relationships and stuff like that. I'm thinking of Walt Whitman and Leonardo da Vinci and maybe Oscar Wilde. I don't know. He just went on listing these people, and I was like, wait a minute, I know what all these people have in common.
That is so funny. So you felt like in that moment, you felt like you were starting to like own it a little bit more.
Yeah, yes, I had a very hard time because, you know, I am an ADHD fella as well. So they used to call me Space Cadet and Spaz. You know, those are the two archetypes of that ADHD type where, yes, I'm usually in my own universe, but there's an extroverted part of me that always has to like come out and be crazy. You know, it's as if the weirdness in me gets bottled up and then needs some sort of expression. Yeah, yeah. And so over the years, everyone who knew me in high school, like, you know, when I look back, I had a very positive high school experience, actually, because the more I did express myself, the more people liked me. And I think that that's what Risk is about, too. You know, when I first started Risk, the comments on iTunes especially were, you know, there would be people who would be like, oh my God, why do we have to listen to this faggot? And he's so over the top, and his personality is like nails on a chalkboard. And, you know, all these comments at first really, really weighed me down.
Yeah.
But then I started to realize that I was like, wait a minute. That's like 1 out of every 15 comments. And the others are all talking about how much they adore you. So the math starts adding up that there's a lot more people out there who are really responding well. And I think that that's a lesson for everyone. Like be yourself. People are going to dislike you whether you're yourself or not yourself. So you might as well be yourself, and a lot more people will probably come around and like you for who you are.
Yeah, well, and yes, I completely agree. And I also think that like the sooner that you can recognize that and own that, I feel like the more that you start to step in line with your natural path, your natural And I have so many questions, but one, you know, you talked about when you first came out with Risk on iTunes. I want to know, I was thinking about this today when I was getting ready to interview you. I was thinking about how I felt like you and the Risk podcast were really the forefront of the storytelling genre and how it's really blown up. When you were first starting and when you first, you know, created the show and were on iTunes and everything, did you feel like it was something that was completely new concept? Did you feel like there was other things around that were similar, or did you just like, we're just going to throw this out, we're going to see what happens?
No, well, here's the thing. I was extraordinarily aware. So what happened was this. After my sketch comedy group, The State, broke up in 1996, I started trying to do sketch comedy alone, all by myself. In other words, getting up on stage and doing bits, character bits, kind of like Andy Warhol, you know, kind of stuff.
Yeah.
Or, no, not Andy Warhol, Andy Kaufman, sorry.
Oh, yeah. I was like, yeah, sure. It's funny you mentioned Andy Warhol, because I have been obsessed lately with the Torch Song trilogy, and the theater, the La Mama Theater, and like all of that. So it's very interesting you bring him up, because I have been like doing a bunch of research on him too. So maybe it was just kismet, but
yeah.
But he had the bits.
Andy Warhol is always in the air.
All things pretty.
No, but yeah, so I started off doing character bits on stage, and I was doing it for years and getting nowhere with it.
Okay.
And finally, I did a show of all characters in 2008. I did a show, it was like 5 different characters in this one show. And Michael Ian Black, who was a member of The State, came to see it. And afterwards, he got really real with me. He was like, Kevin, I really feel like you'd be better off if you were just getting up on stage and telling your own true stories, just being yourself, if you just dropped this character thing.
Yeah, like you're enough.
Yeah, and I said, that feels like it's too risky because there's so many sides of myself that are so contradictory or just unusual and would freak people out. And he was like, well, if it feels risky, that's probably a good sign. That means you're opening up, and then audiences are more likely to open up to you.
Mm-hmm.
So the very next week, I returned to New York. I had been in San Francisco to do that show, and I returned to New York, and I was like, all right, I'm going to try telling a true story at a storytelling show, and I'm going to make it the riskiest story I can think of. Now, I had no experience with storytelling shows at that point. I had never walked into one or heard one.
Okay.
But by that time, in 2008, The Moth, which was kind of really the granddaddy of short form true storytelling shows. The Moth, what they did was, you know, Spalding Gray was especially influential in the 80s of popularizing the personal true story sort of monologue. He used to do like 90-minute true stories, and it was hugely popular, and a lot of other performance artists started doing that too. And then The Moth, in around about 1998, I think,
Okay.
they kind of crystallized this idea of, oh, okay, a person has a limited amount of time to get up and tell just about a few incidents in their life, and but they also made it a competition and all that sort of thing.
Yeah.
So the Moth really ushered in the era of true storytelling. It very, very similar to the folk music craze in the early 60s, late 50s, early 60s, where it was the kind of thing where, yes, the whole idea was anyone can do this. Obviously, there's going to be your Bob Dylans or whatnot, but there's also
you're like true norths.
Yes, yeah, but there's also going to be this idea that anyone can pick up a guitar and sing a song that's been around for 150 years.
Yeah.
And that's what kind of true storytelling became, and it was great, but I had no experience with The Moth when I started out. And you know what I decided was to keep it that way, because I did start listening to The Moth. They used to put out a podcast around about 2008, which was just one story per episode.
Oh, okay.
So when I got interested in true storytelling, after telling my first true story what happened was, I went to UCB, told my first true story at this storytelling show, and I thought that the riskiest story I could think of to tell was about the first time I tried prostituting myself when I was 23 years old.
Wow.
So it was a story about trying to be a hustler, and the first night of trying that, failing miserably.
Okay, wait. It's like you're saying like the performance?
What's that?
You're saying the performance failing miserably, or yourself being a prostitute?
Oh, no. I'm saying the story was all about how the first time I tried prostituting myself,
It was just
I was very unsuccessful and ended up in like a fist fight with the guy and all, and so I decided this would be interesting to share this story as my first story because it feels really risky. It's very sexual. There's my dick is out at one point in the story.
True story.
And it's also vulnerable because I didn't choose prostitution for fun.
No.
When I was 23, I mean, I totally love and respect that some people do it for different reasons, but for me, it was the rent needed to be paid.
Yeah.
And so I felt like it was a very vulnerable and revealing story to tell as well. And I was terrified. I tried to back out of doing the show.
Wow.
And I remember when I was working on the story, all the self-criticism that I later saw coming at me on YouTube or on iTunes. And the criticism my mother used to kind of ladle over my head when I was in high school would kept occurring to me as I was composing the story. I kept thinking things like, oh, this part, I sound so faggy. Ooh, it's too gay. I've got to get rid of that. Or, oh, this part sounds so Midwestern. Such a corny, friendly, polite guy. Ooh, I don't like myself there. And I kept coming to those places on stage with this audience and feeling that trepidation of, oh, I'm about to say something really gay, or I'm about to say something that sounds really Midwestern.
Like that inner critic when it went up stage with you. Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah. And what happened was that the more I just went ahead and let those things be, the more I just like said the gay thing or said the Midwestern thing or whatever, the more the audience was leaning forward and into the story. Like I was having a very visceral experience of, oh, they get that this is a risky story to be telling. They get that I'm kind of a weird mix of personality traits, but they're appreciating this honesty. They really are. It's exactly what Michael Ian Black had said. I'm taking a risk and revealing and opening up, and they're opening up to me because of it.
Yeah, they're going on the ride with you.
Yeah, and that was such a profound experience that night that it really was one of those epiphany moments, because for the past 12 years, I had been getting up on stage acting like kooky characters. But on this particular night, I felt an energy between me and the audience, which I just hadn't felt before. There was like an electricity, and there was an intimacy. There was a real, like, I'm really reaching you and you're really hearing me.
I'm exposing it.
Yeah. And so I walked away buzzing, and I walked down 8th Avenue away from the UCB Theater that night, and the entire concept of risk occurred to me during that walk home.
Wow.
I thought to myself, I should create a show, and here's the whole logic of it. It was, I should create a show that forces me to be getting up on stage regularly and telling stories like that one I just told, because if I don't have a deadline, then I don't do the work, and I let stage fright and social anxiety keep me back. So if I create a show where I'm forced to tell a true story every time I'm up on stage, that's really going to build me up. However, this show should be the theme that made me just tell that story. It should be where everyone who gets up on stage is stepping outside of their comfort zone and revealing something that they're actually kind of afraid to be telling in mixed company. They're kind of coming out about something. And I thought, well, they can be funny stories, they can be terrifying stories, they can be anywhere emotionally, as long as it's really kind of feeling risky and opening up.
Yeah.
And then I thought, but it should also be a podcast, which I was only just learning about the existence of, because this was 2009, the beginning of 2009 when all this happened. And podcasts had been around for a few years, but I was only just learning about them.
Yeah, that makes sense, because when I started listening, my first year in college was 2009, the 2009-2010 year. So that makes perfect sense.
Yeah. So, but I thought it should be a podcast, because I had learned over the years that small room comedy will only get you so far. You know what I mean? Like 50 people in a room is great, but if you want to reach a larger audience, everyone was realizing you should mount something on YouTube or make a podcast, etc. So I decided it should be a podcast, and there was one more aspect to it. I thought, this will be the thing that could help me to finally slay the dragon of that inner critic, especially the voice of my mom in my head saying, you can't say that in public. Ironically, my mom used to always say to me, why do you want to be like someone like George Carlin? You should be someone like Bill Cosby. Now, of course, what she meant was, why do you have to be pushing the envelope? You should be someone like who's family friendly and universal, right?
Right.
My mom, throughout my entire childhood, the thing we would argue about the most was nonconformity. Whenever I would do something that flustered her, she would say, do you have to be such a nonconformist? And even when I came out as gay, she said, are you sure you're not just doing this to be a nonconformist?
Oh, Lord.
So when I was 39, was me kind of creating Risk. It was that, and it was that I was so tired of auditioning and trying to be someone else when I was auditioning. I was always thinking, you know, because you go into auditions and people are like, okay, so we know you're the gay guy from the States. So how gay are you going to be? Or, oh, wait, you do seem Midwestern and you have red hair. So
there's like always putting it in a box.
They're always putting you in a box. And I was never quite fitting into boxes. So when I created Risk, I was like, this is where I can explore various sides of my personality that might not fit into any Hollywood executive's box and would maybe make my mother blush, but will be good for me to finally just being me and putting it out there. And the podcast was all of those things. In the early days of Risk, because I have such a crazy sexual history, you know, I didn't identify as kinky when I first started Risk, but I definitely thought of myself as someone who's pretty hypersexual and has a crazy history of sexual adventures. And that was the thing I was able to use to be the Pied Piper of helping people to feel comfortable about telling stories of it. So people got used to this idea of, oh, the host of the show is very friendly and very, you know, like approachable and agreeable, you know, like a very nice sounding guy from the Midwest and all that, but who is able to talk about very crazy, sexual, kinky things.
And normal.
And that made everyone feel comfortable, like, well, if he can talk about that, then I can maybe talk about this much more, you know, traumatic sounding thing, you know? So it was interesting. And it was funny because one of the first times I told a non-kinky or a non-sexual story on Risk, the audience was really thrown. A story about how Catholic I was, about how devoutly Catholic I was when I was a teenager. That story is called Man at Hawaii, and it's one of my favorites. I love it too. Yeah. But when I first told that story live, the audience was like, what? This isn't the kinky guy, you know what I mean? And so that was a great reminder of, oh, wait, don't let them put you in a box either, you know what I mean?
Well, it's so, that speaks to it too, because like I said earlier, it's you were normalizing something, and it's so interesting that you talk about this very conservative Catholic upbringing you had, because I think that a lot of people, I'm sure a large quantity of your audience, myself included, grew up in similar households where sex wasn't even talked about. Yeah. And it was also something where not only was it not talked about, but it was also made to be a very scary, dangerous thing. That's one thing that I was so blown away when I first started listening to the podcast, was it just opened my mind. You put it so well, it was this idea that all of these stories and all of these things, it was like, oh, there's lots of people out there that sound just like me, that talk just like me, and that had similar upbringings as me, and they're living these like wonderfully adventurous lives, and they're completely fine.
You know? Yeah, you know, it's really interesting. Like so there's a story on Risk called Kevin Goes to Kink Camp. That was, I think, 2011. So that was like a year and a half or 2 years into the history of the podcast, where I went to someone dared me to go to a kink camp, and I took the dare and I went and I had like a transformational sort of weekend where I was like, oh my God, this is what I am. And so it was great to be able to like explore that on the podcast itself. But in the process, it was very interesting because over the years, I have had so many people write me emails or reach out in one way or another saying, oh my gosh, I thought I was such a freak. I have never told anyone about my paraphilia for this or my weird fantasy about that.
Mm-hmm.
And it's just, because I started off the show thinking, oh, well, it's the whole like gay come out of the closet thing. But over the years, it became very quickly apparent, like, oh no, everyone's got something.
Yes, and I think that is what is so amazing about what you have created with the podcast. And it warms my heart too, because you talking about when you had that first experience with that story where you decided to go to those places that you were like coming up with resistance within yourself.
Yeah.
And when you did that, you started to naturally find this path, and then it took you to this thing, and then it took you to this thing, and now you found this channel where all these other people, you've given permission for all these other people to feel like they're not strange, they're not, we all have our thing, like you said. And that is such a beautiful message and concept with risk, and why I think I fell in love with it too. And that brings me to my next question. You had talked about auditioning and then just accepting this unusual quality of how you're finding your storytelling and your truth and all these things. I want to go back and talk about, so you talked about growing up in Ohio.
Mm-hmm.
And where did you go to college? And I want to know everything about how you came to find the state. Did you have to audition? Did you form it? I want to know everything. And I'm sure the listeners do too.
Yeah, it's so funny. Like, so in high school, I was so mad at my parents when freshman year came around because I wanted to go to the School for Creative and Performing Arts. There's one of those fame style schools in Cincinnati, and Sarah Jessica Parker went there and was friends with a friend of mine and all. And at that time, I think she was even on Square Pegs. She was a few years older than me.
Mm-hmm.
So it was like, that's where I should be. I should be at the School for Creative and Performing Arts. But unfortunately, that was not a Catholic school. So my parents were not going to allow that. Well, my mom was not going to allow that. So I went to St. Xavier High School, a Jesuit high school, and what was fascinating about the Jesuits is that, especially in the Midwest, like they're very liberal compared to the rest of the Catholic Church. And they happened to, the year, my freshman year, they happened to hire a lesbian theater director for my high school, who was this dynamo of a woman, just this incredible force to be reckoned with, who decided, I'm going to make the theater program at St. Xavier High School make the School for Performing Creative Arts, look like kids play.
Yeah.
And she did. So I was like, oh my gosh. Suddenly I'm in this high school where I'm thriving. I'm very popular in this theater program. And people like, I was working in high school next to people like Andy Blankenbuehler, who is the choreographer of In the Heights and Hamilton, like a lot of the people that were in my theater program in high school now work on Broadway. But anyway, I wasn't sure whether I wanted to be an actor, a director, a writer. I wasn't exactly sure, but I loved movies. Mm-hmm. And I was really like enamored with the whole idea of going off to New York City. For one thing, I had a dream of going to New York City ever since I was a little kid, and I saw the Time magazine cover. I think it was like in 1977 that showed two male hands holding on the front cover. Mm-hmm. Then you open it up and there was a picture of some like BDSM gay bar in New York, and you could see a guy's butt in this picture in Time magazine. And I'm like 7 or 8 years old, and I'm like, okay, someday I've got to move to that city. So I was like, I'm gonna go to New York in order to be gay, and to go to the film school where Martin Scorsese went and all that kind of thing.
And how old were you when these thoughts were forming? This was in high school or even younger?
In high school was when it was becoming clear to me I should go to NYU if I can.
That's amazing.
But no, I mean, I was always like obsessed with records and movies and books, as a kid. I saw Citizen Kane when I was 9, and it really kind of changed my life. It was the moment when I was like, oh, wait a minute, a movie is a work of art. You know what I mean? Like for some reason that hadn't occurred to me, but when I saw Citizen Kane, I was so struck by it, without without anyone saying, here's what the reputation of this movie is. I just happened to see it and was like, what the fuck? So I all throughout junior high, I would go down to the Moviola, the art house, and see, Fellini and Kurosawa and all those guys. And so, I became a big film buff. And so I thought maybe I can become a director and go to NYU. When I got to NYU, I was in for a rude awakening. Like, this was 1988 when I arrived at NYU.
And now, did you was that a lengthy process to get in, or was it pretty like straightforward?
I think I got in on a personal essay, quite frankly. You know what I mean? Like, I'm very, very, very glad that a lot of colleges, especially creative schools, take a personal essay seriously, because I'm good at that. You know what I mean? But I don't necessarily have the SAT scores. I mean, I score high in like English and shit like that, but math and all that kind of stuff, I'm down the drain.
Nope.
But anyway, yes. So I got to NYU, and I was immediately struck by, there's sexism in and around the filmmaking world. There's sexism at this school. There's kind of a macho bros club and also classism. Like, at NYU, your chances of being the kid who made the senior thesis that got Hollywood's attention had everything to do with if your parents could finance that movie. You know what I mean? Like NYU, there are other, like, I think USC and UCLA might help the kids pay for their movies, but NYU was, no, we'll rent you the equipment and you pay for your movie. And I mean, it was hard enough just paying to be at NYU.
Right. God.
So I was immediately very intimidated. My cinematography classes, I was just like, oh my God, it's all so technical. Mm-hmm. So I realized I'm going to have to veer toward writing and acting, where I just have much more of an affinity. And fortunately, the film program allows you to like readjust and go for focusing mostly on those things. But while I was there in my freshman year, I spied Joe Latrulio in the hallways at school, and just typical, if there is a driving force in my life, it's Kevin pursuing butts. Like, if I make it to the promised land someday, it's probably going to be accidentally because someone with a beautiful butt led me there, right?
Just a bunch of tight asses.
Yeah. So I was like, oh my God, I thought Joe Latrulio was just the cutest thing ever. And so one day I was hanging around the hallways and I thought, it's drop ad day. There's Joe Latrulio. I don't even know if I knew his name, quite frankly. But I'm gonna sit at, this is total stalker stuff. I'm gonna sit outside his counselor's office and eavesdrop to see what classes he's dropping and what classes he's adding, so that I can get into his classes, right?
Yeah.
And so he was taking a Super 8. This is so funny that NYU in 1988, they, freshman year, you could take a Super 8 class, right?
What
Working
is
with
Super 8 at the last
Super 8, it's a kind of film. Like
okay.
you don't get to use film in schools anymore. So anyway, yeah. But it's the kind of film that you're used to see, like the tiniest kind that you're seeing from home movie footage. From whenever you see home movie footage in a movie, it's someone's home Super 8 camera. But anyway, so I got into Joe's Super 8 class, and one day and quickly found out he was heterosexual. I mean, all of his projects were about his girlfriend. So I was like, all right, barking up the wrong tree there.
Lost that one.
But one day he came to class and he was like, oh, I'm in a comedy group and I'm inviting everyone in class to come to our comedy group's first show. And I was like, oh, that sounds interesting. That sounds like something fun to do. I'm going to go to Joe Latrulio's comedy group show. And I went, and everyone in the state and friends of the state remember that night. That night was another one of those eureka moments.
Mm-hmm.
It was the state's first performance together. At the time, the group was called The New Group because we were the new comedy group on campus.
Okay.
And it was the group's first show. But there was an energy in that room. It was just a black box theater in 721 Broadway, the Tisch School of the Arts.
Mm-hmm.
But there was an energy in the audience and up on stage where everyone was, like in the audience, everyone was laughing as if we were at one of those Monty Python shows where everyone knows all the sketches. You know what I mean? Where it's just like singing along and everything. Like, it was like, wait, why does this feel like this is already classic and no one has seen this before? There was just this like, wow, this is special. This group is magic. There's a chemistry here. This is working as if it was meant to be.
Yeah.
And so I determined, okay, just as I stalked Joe Latrulio, I'm going to stalk this comedy group until they let me in.
Yeah. How did that go?
It went great. All I had to do was keep dropping and adding classes to make sure I was in everyone's, classes, so that everyone was like, "Oh, hey, this guy is in my class too." Right. So the group would hang out at this place called the Dugout, where you could get like dollar beers. This East Village kind of punk rock kind of bar that no longer exists, and for really cheap beer. And one night, the whole group was there, and everyone knew me because I was in all their classes. And I went to the bathroom, and there was an inch of water on the floor of the bathroom that looked very yellow.
Oh, no.
And I got the idea, and this is an example of what I was talking about before. Kevin has a tendency to need to come out in a very explosive, extroverted way every now and then. And this was the night for that with the state, where I took off all my clothes in a public bar, in a bar in the East Village. I removed all my clothes, except for my Doc Martens, because there was an inch of urine water on the floor. And I exited the bar with a pint of beer in my hand and I was improvising a whaling song, like an old, like Pirates or Whalers kind of song, while I was walking around the bar completely nude. And everyone was just like, what the fuck is happening? And once I had walked around the bar once singing this song, I just went right back in the bathroom and put my clothes back on and came back. And I sat down at the table with the other members of the state, and Carrie Kenny said to me, "You're crazy. You need to hang out with us more often." And I was like, there you go. That's my kind of auditioning.
That is amazing. So how long from like that time to when did you guys form it and then just start shopping the idea of a show? You know, did MTV, I mean, you're in New York already. NYU is like the breeding ground for a lot of these projects. How did that group become picked up by MTV?
Right. The NYU revoked the group's right to be an NYU group. In other words, we could no longer use 721 Broadway as a place to do shows, etc., because the group insisted that the integrity of the group was so great, like the chemistry of the group was so great. But in order to be recognized by NYU, we would have to have auditions every year and accept new members. You know what I mean? And we were like, no, we're happy with who we are. We don't want to do that. So instantly we were in this weird, like there weren't theaters like the Pit or like UCB or stuff. So we had to like, you know, ask our parents for money to rent theaters to do these shows. And I remember one time we did the show in a theater where it cost us $7,000
Oh my
to do the show there for like, I don't know, 2 weekends or something like that. And what happened was David Wayne had been interning at MTV, and I think he interned at both Letterman and MTV. And so he was able to invite a producer at MTV that he knew.
Wow.
And this producer at MTV knew of a person at William Morris, an agent at William Morris. So those two came to one of our shows when we, you know, had rented a theater for $7,000. And they were like, this is amazing. You guys really have a lot of potential. Let's put together a best of you guys, you know, like the best sketches you've come up with in your 4 years at NYU. And we'll invite actual executives from, it was mostly MTV and ABC. There was a lot of, might we go to ABC very early on? But ABC decided they wanted only Ken Marino, the best looking one. And they offered him $50,000 to leave the group and just have one of those like retainers of, you know, we can do whatever we want with you.
Yeah.
And he refused, you know, which for someone who's just graduated from college is impressive.
Yeah.
But no, MTV, very shortly after our, you know, it wasn't even a whole year, I think, after we'd graduated from NYU, that MTV said, okay, we want to include you guys in this show called You Wrote It, You Watch It. And Jon Stewart was the host of that show. But there were a bunch of other comedy groups and creative duos and other, you know, there were a lot of contributors to that show. And when it was canceled after the first season, MTV said, that show didn't work so well, but Jon Stewart was amazing, and so was the state. Everything that the state did together was amazing. Why don't we give both of them their own shows? So he got his talk show, the Jon Stewart Show on MTV, and we got the state.
Were you freaking out?
Yeah. Well, that's, you know, that story that I tell, the Hustler story.
Yeah.
MTV did a thing where they had us, I think, they had us shoot a pilot, and then they had 6 months to determine whether or not they wanted to pick us up. And for those 6 months, we were not allowed to take work elsewhere contractually. So 6 months in, we were starving. And that's when I attempted prostitution. And it was at the end of that weekend, after my prostitution adventures, that we got the call, okay, you have been picked up by MTV.
That is insane. So going from there, then getting picked up, did you guys just immediately go into like production? Did you guys, were you meeting with people? Were they having you come up with concepts? Like, how did that work?
Yeah, we had, what was interesting was that, like I said, there wasn't comedy education in New York City at that time.
Mhm.
You couldn't take classes on how to structure a sketch, and you couldn't really even take many classes on improvisation. Like, we didn't have a strong presence of Second City or anything like that in New York for young people at that time.
Mhm.
Or, and UCB didn't exist yet and all that. So we were really just making up sketch comedy based on the fact that we all watched Sesame Street and The Muppet Show and Saturday Night Live and Monty Python when we were kids. And so we were just making stuff up based on our own instincts and things we had seen before. But the group had an amazing chemistry. The group had a spectacular sense of humor. It was a very weird group because there were 11 of us, an insane amount of people to be working together and all trying to get into the spotlight.
And a lot of personalities, yeah.
Lot of egos, a lot of fighting, a lot of power plays. I'll vote for your sketch if you vote for mine, that sort of thing. So, you know, I was the member of the group. There were a couple members of the group who were just naturally less competitive, less egotistical, less, or maybe a little bit more submissive, you know what I mean? And I was one of those. And so I struggled. I really struggled. But also, I always felt like, you know, the people who worked on your show of shows, it was an incredible cast of writers. It was Carl Reiner and Mel Brooks and Woody Allen
Yeah.
and Neil Simon, just
Mhm.
all these brilliant people. And they would always laugh their asses off when Mel Brooks would pitch a sketch in the writer's room. And then they would always say, yeah, but we're not going to do that on TV. And I was the Mel Brooks of the state. I was a person who was constantly pitching stuff that made the whole group laugh, but made them feel like, yeah, but it's just so bizarre that
Out there.
that, you know, the executives are not going to go for it.
Yeah.
And indeed, you know, there were a few. There were one of my sketches with several gay jokes in it was so created such a ruckus at MTV that we had to make a sketch apologizing for it.
Oh my God. That's so crazy. That is insane. What a story. Well, I mean, I could ask you so many questions. I don't want to take up too much of your time, but I do have two really quick questions that I want to ask you before we end. And one is, in you know, you talk about New York back then and creating the show and your journey into Risk. And one of my most nostalgic and favorite things about listening to Risk are the live shows and hearing the interaction of the audience, hearing them talk. And I hope, fingers crossed, that eventually we'll get back to that place where these theaters in New York are open again and I get the chance to do a story from a live stage. But it brings me back to, speaking of being online and doing a lot of stuff now with COVID, you know, with social media, I always try to ask people about this because it's something that is both controversial and also like something that I think a lot of people struggle with, on whether or not you can make, you know, quote unquote, captivating, genuine art with so much saturation and so much social media and so much editing. What are your feelings on social media, Instagram, all these ones with people making, you know, comedy and these skits and all these things in such a fast pace and such a, you know, you just come up with something, you throw it out there. There's no kind of curating it. What are your thoughts on that? Are you for it, against it? Are you indifferent?
Well, I mean, in general, from the broad strokes of things, I have always been a huge champion of do-it-yourself
Mm-hmm.
sort of art,
Yeah.
because I spent so many years not knowing how to work my way up the system. You know what I
Yeah.
mean? Not how to get past the gatekeepers, how to package myself in a way that like seemed sellable, all that kind of thing.
The predetermined
Um,
ideas.
yeah. And so I love very dearly, you know, another person who was starting their podcast at the very same time that Risk was starting was Mark Maron.
Mm.
Maron was on the very first in the very first Risk Live show in New York in 2009. He also did the very first Risk Live show in Los Angeles that we ever did over there. And he was very kind to us because he had just started his podcast, and he was like, listen, I think you've got a great idea here. Let me introduce you to some people to give you some advice on how to do a podcast, etc.
Yeah.
But it was very encouraging to see, you know, because I had known Mark, I mean, not well, but I had known him from comedy going back into the mid 90s. And I had seen that he had struggled to make anything work in the system until he created his own show where he could just be himself and find a wider audience that way. And I did the exact same thing. So I think it's really, really powerful and important that there is a DIY space out there. It's been profoundly unsettling for me to watch the inevitable happen with podcasts, and that is that major corporations have stepped in and said, you know, we're going to give like Joe Rogan or whatever $100 million, yada, yada. And like, there's just a lot of marketing money and a lot of money thrown behind corporate podcasts now. And they're kind of taking all the air out of the room. They're kind of taking all the audience with them.
Yeah.
And so little indie podcasts like Risk have a harder time being a big fish in that pond anymore. You know, back in the day, we were, you know, one of the top 10 podcasts often, but now we're kind of eclipsed by big money coming into big money podcasts. And so, but I will say this, one of the reasons that Risk is so phenomenal is that we created super, super rigorous standards for ourselves. You know, I was in the very earliest days of the show, I listened to a lot of The Moth, even though I never entered a Moth room, because I knew that The Moth was a little bit of a church. I knew it was a little bit, that there was something a little bit culty about The Moth, a little bit like there were a lot of hype around The Moth.
There was a certain kind of following.
Yeah, and I didn't want to be too swayed by that. You know, I didn't want to start following their formula too closely. So I avoided it. But in the early days of creating the podcast, I did listen to a lot of their podcast episodes to find out how podcasts are done. And I listened to a lot of This American Life, and I listened to a lot of Joe Frank's old show from the 80s that had inspired Ira Glass so much, or that Ira Glass, I think, was the assistant on.
Yeah.
So I was really interested in, you know, creating an audio experience that was unpredictable and, you know, where there's a lot of room for audio creativity. There's a lot of sound collage and music and workshopping the stories. I mean, from the very beginning, Risk was a place where, you know, to this very day, so many people are offended that we're like, no, if you want to tell a story on Risk, you have to run a couple versions by us first. We have to like give you notes, give you feedback, help you shape it so that it like fits Risk, you know? And you can do that when you're This American Life and you have a huge reputation and a lot of money behind you. But when you're this little indie podcast, a lot of people have big egos about, you're not going to give me any notes. You know what I mean? But we've always been insistent. We've been like, no, there has to be a real rigorous process here. And a lot of the stories that are told on stage, we don't run. And a lot of the stories we record for radio, we don't end up running. Yeah. So the show I've always said, it's very ADHD of me to create things that are very, very hard to keep going. You know, it's very typical of an attention deficit disorder to be like, I've got a project and it's going to be really hard. And when I start it, I'll be very focused. But to maintain that focus for 11 years will be damn near impossible. And that is the show that I've created.
I'm laughing so hard as a fellow ADHD person. Not only do I know exactly what you're talking about, but oh my God, so many times. I literally, right now in my life, have a coach that I pay every week to help me stay on task because I am exactly the same way.
Yeah, I'm considering getting an ADHD coach, or at least I'm considering getting switching my meds for it.
Yeah, I get what you're talking about. And one thing I will say too, to go back to what you were saying on how you do take such care and you curate these episodes in the podcast, was I can only liken it to, when I was a kid, I grew up with, on the AM station, I think it was 580 AM, at 11 o'clock at night, they would do an old time radio story on the AM.
Oh,
It was
cool.
my favorite because I grew up, we didn't have a record player growing up, but there was just something so nostalgic and that old time storytelling that you had to use a lot of your own senses to create the story.
Yes. Yeah, it's the theater of the imagination.
Yeah. And there was something, and I've always been fascinated, similarly to you, I've always been fascinated with New York and old time New York and a lot of these things. And so I will say that and what I hope is the best compliment to you in the podcast is, when I first discovered it, when I first started going to college, was what I likened to when I first discovered those radio time shows when I was a kid, because it was the first time where I would listen to people that were in real time, in current situations, but I would get excited about my drive to there and back to school, because I had this like new experience that I got to have where I was in my car, I was driving, but I got to I got to be entertained by these people's real life stories. And that was there, that entertaining and that storytelling part, but there was also this sense of like, these are real people just like me.
Yeah.
And like your friend, I get to listen to my friends tell these stories. And there was something so new, but also so wonderful and nostalgic. Like I was listening to those old stories when I was a kid. And so I always loved that. And I still remember, like, I would get so excited when you do the themes, like the holiday stories and like, those would always make me so excited because it put me into the mood for Halloween. You're scared.
Oh, yeah.
I love it because it's like, it's almost like if you're somebody that's really busy or that you don't have a lot of time to socialize, you get that same experience of sitting down.
Yeah. I mean, to circle back to your question about DIY stuff, I think that the tender loving care that you're talking about in Risk is what sets it apart from so many other podcasts in a lot of ways. Like, you can tell that the whole staff really considers this a labor of love. Yes. And you can tell that the storytellers themselves have really thought through and felt through and processed what they're trying to share with you. So I think it's very powerful because so much tender loving care goes into it. Now, is it also important to have media? This part drives me crazy. Like, I don't have many Twitter followers. I don't have many Instagram followers. And JC is constantly saying, that's because you should be producing content every day where it's a funny little sketch, where it's a little song, you should be constantly flooding people with entertaining little stuff that builds your audience on those platforms. And I will say that, yeah, it is really kind of frustrating that we now live in this area where people are so flooded with content that it's a little overwhelming to like sift through it all. But I also say, as an artist, like, I myself feel the need to find something akin to Risk that's way, way, way easier to produce. Like, I would love to create another podcast or an Instagram series or whatever that I also found tremendous joy in, but that I could really just press a button and put out there. I do really, there's a podcast that I'm really jealous of. called My Dad Wrote a Porno. Have you heard of that?
I haven't heard any of the episodes, but I see it every now and again.
Yeah, the whole thing is that these three British journalists, and they're writers, they're creative people. One of them, their father, wrote under a pseudonym a pornographic novel akin to, he read 50 Shades of Grey.
Yeah.
And he was like, so this like 70-year-old man was like, I can do that. So he wrote a pornographic novel of his own, and his son, the journalist, discovered it, the book.
That's amazing.
And was like, oh my God, this is the most ridiculously written thing I've ever read. And so he and his two journalist friends, they sit and they drink wine and beer, and they just read passages of this novel and laugh. And the reason I'm so jealous of this is because that's the easiest fucking podcast in the world to produce. Talk about
fun, drink wine and talk about, oh my God, that'd be amazing.
And the father has been so, like it's caused, like his book now sells really well on Amazon. So he's just continuing the series, so they never run out of material.
It reaps the benefits. It's like, well, it is tricky, but I think like, to go back to what you were saying too, it breaks my heart a little bit, but I understand it, because like you said, with all the new content coming out, and especially with podcasts being saturated and now breaking out into like performance podcasts where there's fiction, there's there's these radio plays, all these things. It makes me think of podcasts like yours, where you say that you guys take so much care, because when you hear a Risk episode, that not only are all those stories personal and emotional, but I have never listened to an episode on Risk, funny, silly, sexual, traumatic, whatever, across the board, and not felt emotionally connected. And I think that's because, how you said, you guys really help those storytellers find another layer, find another emotional attachment. And so when you go on and you perform it, whether it's a live show or on the podcast, there is a level that the person who is telling the story and performing is connected in a way that they're having the emotional experience along with the audience.
Yeah. Another thing that Risk does, which I think is a little bit hard to do, is that we speak to the highest intelligence of the audience. Like oftentimes there are stories where I understand, as the curator of the show, some of you are going to have very mixed feelings about this, or some of you are going to feel like, wait, I want to ask that storyteller some questions. You know what I mean? Like, for example, we just did the Halloween episode. It's called Scary Stories 12. And it's the nature of scary stories that, like Poe and Lovecraft and those kinds of stories, where you finish the story and you're like, wait a minute, I want to ask that narrator some questions.
There's a lot more that didn't get talked about.
Right. Or cases where a listener will be like, well, I think that person clearly should be in some sort of, AA or something like that. And it's like, like as the curator of the show, yes, I often too hear something from someone and think, that's not how I would have reacted to that. And I'll let the storytellers know that. And I'll often suggest to the storytellers that they also run their story by their therapist or by yada, yada. Yeah. But the show is done in such a way that the audience seems to more or less understand. Not only are you going to have to use the theater of the imagination a little bit here and see the cinematography in your own head, but you're also going to have a lot of feelings about some of these storytellers or the choices they made, and that's okay, Yeah,
and it's almost like, it made me think of like when you watch a really good movie, to bring it back to your film experience back when you were in college and everything, when you watch a really good movie where someone does a really good performance in a film, you oftentimes leave the film with like anger at like what happened. I've seen so many films where I feel like I want to go right the wrong, or I want to go like take care of this person. There, not to do a spoiler, but I watched Million Dollar Baby for the first time, the Hillary Swank.
Uh-huh.
And I won't give away, but like what happens to her and then the person involved in that it's in a beautiful artistic choice that's just not talked about. But I'm like, so much of me wanted to be like, oh my God, I want to like find out what happened and I want to do this and it's, that's a beautiful quality that just comes naturally with the stories and Risk, because you have that attachment, like, oh my God, this person sounds like they need help. Did they get help? Did they do this? I can't believe they did that. But at the same time, this person is vulnerable on stage and saying those things. So
yeah, people often are telling stories on Risk where they are the bad guy, as it were. They are the person who did something really regrettable or just made a wrong choice, and that they're kind of coming clean about it.
yeah.
And sometimes there will be audience members who will be like, okay, I appreciate that you're coming clean about it, but I still am really angry at you for doing that thing that you did. And that's completely valid.
Yeah, and I think that's what makes it stand out so much, across from other podcasts and stuff, because you do get that, and I think that's also the healing nature of what you do with the podcast as well, is because these people are doing this, but they're also not only getting a chance to let it off their chest in a brave way, where the people are going to have those emotions, but they're doing it and they're not going to be attacked. At least they're not going to be attacked in person or on the podcast. Right. And I think there's something so wonderful about that. And I think that's why I too gravitated towards it, because you just hear these stories and it affects you. The bravery of these people telling these stories is like, okay, whatever kind of things that I'm dealing with, I'm going to be okay, because these people are like talking about these things. And the more you talk about them, the less they have power, the less that they,
Yeah, and another thing I will say, and this I think surprises a lot of people, is that process never ends. like there are still things I haven't talked about on the podcast. There are still life experiences where I'm like, gosh, am I ready to unpack that one?
Yeah.
And
all the emotions it brings up.
Yeah. And like, oh, has the audience ever seen this side of me? I feel like the process of removing veils or digging deep, can always continue. Like we're always in the process of finding out more and more how to be who we are.
Yeah, no, it's very true. I guess the last question I'll ask, and then I swear I'll let you go. I'm going to have you on again, because I would love to find out, and this is a whole nother episode, is, how you started and what it was like to start the podcast and get momentum and all of the things that entails in that. But I guess the last question I have for you is, you are such a voice. We talked about how powerful and effective the podcast is, and the nature of people exposing themselves and risking, telling these really brave stories. I've been personally affected by your words, your kind words and your brave words about activism, about truth telling, about all these things. And I want to say, in that vein, I am somebody that in the last few years, I've really recently, come to know and appreciate self-care. And meditation and yoga and things, taking, whether it's 10 or 15, 20 minutes a day, to do something to recenter myself and to like calm the noise and to take care of myself and ask myself, where am I at with all of this? And in doing that, I often think of love and light, whether it's a long run or meditation or something. I try to think of the things that, what is going to give me peace today? What are the things that I'm joyful for, or grateful for? And I would ask you, because I feel like you are somebody who exudes love and light through just the nature of what you do as an artist. What do you feel is the love and light that you have in your life right now? And what do you feel like the love and light is of this wonderful podcast and this art that you've created?
Oh, wow. That's incredible. That's incredible. I would say that one of the things that I find really helpful, I think meditation, and an important thing for people to remember about meditation is that, I think you were hinting at this before, it doesn't need to be a half hour or 20 minutes or 15 minutes. It might just be a minute, you know, it might just be like, even like choosing some activities that are repetitive, like washing the dishes or brushing your teeth, or just something simple like having your morning cup of coffee, where you're like, you know what, let me set aside some space here to let this actually be as mindful a moment as possible, as you
Yeah.
know, like let me settle into just as much as possible just being here now and not being all caught up in things.
Mhm.
But also, you know, I will sometimes speak into a recording device just, and I often don't listen back to them, but for some reason, speaking into a recording device makes me feel like I'm journaling, you know? So after a meditation, like after 10 minutes or 20 minutes or whatever, sitting on a cushion in my bedroom, I will pop open the recording device and just speak for 5 minutes, maybe, about what I'm really grateful for. And it could be just repetitive. It could be, you know, the same thing I said yesterday, or it could be something that had never occurred to me before. And what I really value, you know, what I really like, what I'm grateful for, and what I'm like, what I love, you know, like to kind of recenter myself around, here's the good stuff. Here's the stuff that I'm rooting myself in.
Yeah.
And other than that, um, I would say that I think not enough can be said about maintaining friendships, about cultivating and maintaining friendships,
Mhm.
because especially as an in my own universe kind of guy, I can very easily start to isolate. I can very easily lose track of whether or not I've checked in on this or that person, or how long has it been since we've hung out, you know? And without beating yourself up about that, try to encourage yourself more and more to be keeping friendships going and deepening, you know,
Yeah.
because it's very easy for people to kind of like take friendships for granted, and then and then it's kind of like a plant that is running out of water, you know.
Yeah.
After a while you're like, oh, it's been like 3 years since we've seen each other, you know, that kind of thing.
Well, I mean, if you're like anything like me, and it sounds like you are, what I'll do, and I'm very much like that, where I get in my own world and I have so many ideas and thoughts and all these things, where I will have people that have entered into my life and they're great and they're really beneficial and the friendship is mutual and all these things. But because I oftentimes go into that place of like, I'm doing this thing, and because I don't necessarily need it, but
Yeah.
on the other hand might need it. Do you feel like that happens often, where it's like, do you feel like you don't really need it all the time, so it's harder for you to reciprocate that?
I think I do need it
Yeah.
and am unconscious of that.
Mm.
I think that, you know, like it's very interesting. Like at the age of 50 now, I'm super aware of how much nature means to me. You
Yeah.
know, like just sitting and looking at water rippling, or just being around trees, or just, you know, just whatever, just breathing in fresh air in natural spaces. It's the simplest thing, but the older I've gotten, I've been like, wait a minute, this is the kind of thing that I took for granted, but that actually, it's easy to forget how
Yeah.
meaningful it is to you. So you need to kind of remind yourself, wait a minute, no, it's really good for me to hang out more with these friends, and it's really good for me to be around nature more, you know. It's tough because we've got to juggle so much, you know.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and yeah, I agree. And I think that, to bring it back to social media, one thing that I know for me is hard is because that's just the general adult life thing, is juggling so much that it can be hard. And I have to limit my time with social media. And it's
Yes.
because if I don't, that natural life state of being an adult and just juggling so much, when you're just not, when you're doing the best you can on a really good day, when you add in social media, it becomes that much more hard and can oftentimes put you in a depressive state because you just, in addition to all the things that you're juggling yourself, you're just seeing all these things with other people and it's just pouring on you, you know?
You can very easily fall into compare and despair by looking at social media. And you can just have too much of a waterfall of things going on in your brain, you know? Like I am very, very, very addicted to social media, not just Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook, but also like the kinky communal sites and stuff like that.
There's a lot of good things out there for like those sort of where there's communities that you can get plugged into and where you have like-minded people that you
there's definitely huge pluses to it for sure. But I would say that I think that these things are designed to actually trigger ADHD in people who don't have it really, and to exacerbate it for those of us who do.
Yes,
yeah.
I completely agree. Well, Kevin, you are amazing. I still am pinching myself that I have you on right now. You have spoken so many beautiful things into my life. Risk podcast, like I said, changed my life in so many ways. And I hope to have you on again because I would love to pick your brain even more. But before you go, tell everyone, I know there's the book. Where can everyone get the Risk book?
The Risk book should be available wherever you get books, but you can definitely look it up at theriskbook.com.
Okay.
It has actually an amazing amount of great reviews on Amazon, which is fabulous. And you can find you can find everything related to Risk at risk-show.com. Our socials are at Risk Show. And then my socials on Twitter and Instagram are at the Kevin Allison.
Perfect. And then I'll put links in the YouTube so when everyone watches, they can just link right onto all of your personal pages and stuff like that. So
yeah, and the podcast can be downloaded wherever podcasts are found as well.
Perfect. Thank you so much. This was amazing. I'm so excited that people are going to get to know your story and get to know Risk, and hopefully more and more people in the audience will grow.
Well, thank you. This was absolutely delightful.
Thank you so much, Kevin. I'll see you later. Bye-bye.
Okay. Bye-bye.